Welcome, everyone. My name is Vianna Davila. I'm a journalist with ProPublica and the Texas Tribune. I'll be your moderator this evening. Welcome to Ni Una Más, Seeking Justice for Femicide in Mexico through Poetry, Journalism, and Law. The event tonight is going to begin with a discussion with the journalists and artists who brought this project about the murdered and missing women of Juarez to life in the Seattle Times Magazine in the project Disappearing Daughters. Then we're going to move on to a Q&A session where I'm going to ask the panelists a few questions. And then we've saved the last 30 minutes for you, our wonderful audience. Thank you all for being here, especially in a hard year and a tough time like this. When we get to that portion, we're going to ask you to put your questions in the Zoom Q&A function. Don't worry, I'll remind you when we get to that later. But now I'd like to introduce this amazing group of panelists. Corinne Chin is a senior video journalist at the Seattle Times and an IWMF Adelante Fellow and Pulitzer Center grantee. She supports women journalists through leading the newsroom's Diversity and Inclusion Task Force as a co-director of the Women and Non-Binary Voices Affinity Group of the Asian American Journalists Association, and through virtual coaching as a graduate of the Poynter Leadership Academy for Women. Erika Schultz works as a staff photographer for the Seattle Times, where she focuses on photo and video storytelling. Schultz is an IWMF Adelante Fellow and Pulitzer Center grantee, a co-founder of Northwest Photojournalism, and teaches as a part-time faculty member at the University of Washington School of Communication. Claudia Castro is Washington State Poet Laureate, and she served as Seattle's first civic poet. She is the recipient of an Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellowship, the author of One River, A Thousand Voices, Killing Marias, and the chapbook, The City. Born in El Salvador, she came to the United States in 1981. Learn more about her at castroluna.com. And finally, Norma Ledezma Ortega is an attorney based in the Mexican state of Chihuahua. She is founder of Justicia para Nuestras Hijas, or Justice for Our Daughters. Her work as a defender for the rights of victims of femicide and trafficking has been recognized with various national, international awards and honors, including being asked to speak at the 59th session of the UN Human Rights Assembly in Geneva, Switzerland. And so we're going to start the event tonight with a video and asking the question that it's at the heart of this project: what is femicide?
Thank you so much, Vianna. And just really briefly, femicide by definition is the killing of women for being women. Femicide is a systematic violation of human rights, and it's a crime that's tracked in many Latin American countries, including Mexico, but interestingly enough, not here in the United States. A lot of recorded femicides are cases of intimate partner violence, but it also ranges the spectrum to human trafficking and serial sexual assault. We really wanted to take a look at femicides happening in Juarez, and one of the pieces that we did as part of our project is the one that I'm about to show you.
Fui mamá de 5 hijas, nada más tengo 2. La primera se me murió al nacer, la segunda se me murió de 17 años, derrame cerebral. La más pequeña, Adriana, también falleció. A ella me la robaron, me la desaparecieron. Esta historia yo no la pedí. Esta historia me hicieron vivirla. Adriana tenía 15 años. Siempre tuvo muchos amigos, siempre le gustó mucho la música, el baile. Muy alegre. También era muy renegada, tenía de todo, pero muy alegre, mucho. Era un viernes 18 de enero del 2008. Ella tenía su teléfono y me avisó que iba a ir a comer con sus amigos ese día. Y sí, fue a comer. Según dijo la amiga, eran como las 5:30 de la tarde, cuando ellas venían en el camión. Entonces en el centro se bajó primero la amiga. Supuestamente Adriana siguió hasta la terminal del camión para tomar otro camión que la iba a traer a casa. Desde ese momento ya no sabemos nada. Anduvimos buscando en el centro, en las colonias, en los camiones, en diferentes partes buscamos. Y lo peor del caso es que las autoridades a mí me decían que no lo hiciera público, porque si yo lo hacía público, pues más pronto la iban a matar. Cuando mi mamá se me murió, a mí me decían que era huérfana. Cuando mi esposo se me murió, yo quedé viuda. Pero se me han muerto mis hijas y no tienen nombre. Lucho por estar bien, porque yo quiero estar bien. Todavía es un dolor que esto no se cura con aspirinas. Esto es un dolor que te cortan una parte de tu corazón. El 29 de noviembre de 2011, yo estaba por salir, que iba a ir a trabajar. Mi hija estaba hablando por teléfono con alguien. Entonces, Elizabeth me dice, mamá, estaba hablando con una prima. Y me está diciendo que en el Facebook está saliendo una nota donde dice que los restos de Adriana Sarmiento están en el Servicio Médico Forense de Ciudad Juárez, junto con 15 muchachitas más. Adriana la encuentra el 5 de noviembre del 2009 a un costado del cementerio municipal de San Agustín. La tenían desde el 2009 y yo me di cuenta por las redes sociales, no por ellos, y me doy cuenta en el 2011. Antes de que yo estuviera viviendo esta pesadilla que creo que nunca jamás voy a despertar, para mí la policía era lo máximo. Las autoridades para mí eran lo más respetable que podía haber. Yo me doy cuenta que todo es mentira, porque hay mucha impunidad. ¿Qué les podía haber hecho a mi niña? Mi niña tenía 15 años. ¿Qué les hacía? Tenía toda una vida por delante. Se llevaron una niña buena, una niña que estudiaba, era una niña que era alegre. Yo quiero que se sepa que en Ciudad Juárez esto pasa y que no hay justicia y que no hay autoridad y que juegan con nosotros como les da su maldita gana. Las desapariciones siguen ocurriendo. Esto no para. Esto está de mal en peor y no hay quien haga nada. Nos matan por ser mujeres. ¿Ser mujer es un delito?
Thank you for sharing that video, Corinne. I wanted to start by asking you and Erika to tell us about Disappearing Daughters, what the project is and why you decided to tell this story.
Thank you so much, Vianna, for moderating this evening, and thank you everybody for attending. So Disappearing Daughters is a Seattle Times project that combines poetry, it combines photography, journalism, documentary video to help share mothers and activist stories about femicide, and also to highlight the strength of women in Juarez. We had the honor of collaborating with poet Claudia Castro on this project, and our team of editors and designers created a special online presentation and dedicated the entire Sunday magazine to this important topic. One of the reasons why we wanted to work on this project was to highlight something that academics and the activists who we talked to all agreed on, which is there is a global culture of violence against women. And many of the conditions that make women vulnerable to violence, gender, race, economic disempowerment, are conditions that reach far across the border and conditions that are prevalent in both of our countries.
What you're seeing now is a quick video that takes you through our projects page, which you can find at st.news/disappearingdaughters. And Vianna, one thing you asked us was why we wanted to pursue this story. And as we reported, it was really like peeling back the layers of an onion, where every time we would find something new, we would always find a new why for why we were doing this project. Initially, we were attracted to the story because of Claudia's poetry, which Vianna, you introduced us to, and we'll talk a lot more about later. And also because we felt that this story was untold and really underrepresented. And if you take a look back on a lot of the work that Erika and I have done together as partners, we are really attracted to these stories. We are really passionate about bringing these stories to light, some of the stories that aren't as prevalent in the news. But as we learned more and more about femicide in Juarez, and we met more mothers and we spoke with them, the story became increasingly personal to us. It was really hard not to imagine ourselves in their positions, both mothers and daughters. And we came to learn and realize how universal this story is globally. We had also seen previous media coverage of femicide when we were doing our research, and a lot of it was really gruesome and objectifying, and we really wanted to fight against that. We wanted to create a portrayal that gave these women agency and dignity that they deserve. And we wanted to show how much the mothers in Juarez are a symbol of the fight against femicide globally.
Another perspective that we wanted to include was how US consumption and trade agreements have impacted women in Juarez. We talked with Tony Payan, who is with the Center for the US and Mexico at Rice University, and he also teaches in Juarez. And he shared that for decades, there were many women who moved to Juarez from different parts of Mexico for jobs and for opportunities. He said that, women often lived on the edges of the city. They were paid minimum wage. They often faced long commutes and sometimes dangerous commutes. The presence of drug and human trafficking corridors and weak government institutions have unfortunately created a perfect storm, he said, for violence against women. New Mexico State University professor Cynthia Bejarano said, "We can't negate the role of the United States, the role of capitalism, the role of drug consumption in the United States. Femicide has so much to do with our desires and our addictions here in the US."
And, in the Disappearing Daughters, you write that, the missing and murdered women of Juarez are, quote, the seeds of grief that blossom into art. And when I first saw your project, that's what, I'm a journalist, and obviously it's a work of journalism, but it felt so much like a work of art as well. And it was inspired by another such work, and that's Claudia, your book of poems. My well-worn copy is right beside me right now, called Killing Marias. Can you talk about your book of poetry and its connection to Disappearing Daughters?
Yes, thank you so much. This is just an incredible evening to be here in this space together, all of us, with Norma and Corinne and Erika and you, Vianna, and just all of us bringing light to this issue. I started working on this book. It took me 7 years to write it, and I started working on it the day I came across a list on the website Operación Digna. And this website lists the names of femicide victims in the Juarez area. And as I scrolled through the list of names, the hundreds of names, I was filled with outrage that I, as a fairly well-informed person living in the United States, did not know and had not heard more or hardly heard about this. And just felt incensed that there was such little coverage of these women's deaths. And as I scrolled through the names, I saw that many of the women's names had the name Maria as their first name. Maria is a common name in Latin America, often as a middle name. And at that moment, when I saw those names, I decided on the spot that I would write a poem for each of those women who had the name Maria. And working through the poems was really difficult at times. I felt incredible sadness and grief at times. I felt really angry. At other times, I felt powerless. Also, just in the quiet of my desk, thinking, what is this going to do, writing these poems? How can I contribute to bringing awareness to this issue? Because the issue of femicide and domestic violence is not something that is just, the book, yes, it's set in Juarez because this is where the women lived, but it's not only about Juarez. This happens all over Latin America. It happens here in the US, it happens across the world. As Corinne and Erika have said, this is a global issue. And so the poems in the end, turned out to be a song of protest in a way. They turned out to be, I wanted the book to create a space of remembrance and a space of solidarity. I wanted to insist on the fact that these women lived. I did not want to let them be forgotten. So it was a way of giving them dignity and agency, and also of honoring their families, because the families live, as we have seen in the video and in the work that Corinne and Erika have done, they live with this every day. And so it was a way also of honoring the families and doing it in a way that was really centered on the spiritual and the beautiful and the sacred. And, so the book came about. I did a reading in Seattle. Vianna, you were at that reading. And at the end of the reading, you approached me and said, I know 2 journalists who would be interested in this work. And I was introduced then, Corinne and Erika, myself, were introduced, and here we are.
I'm so glad that we are here. Thank you. I think we are going to watch now one of the video poems.
Exploitation has no limits, man's hypocrisy even less. Human history is smeared with the filth of their spread. Nefarious tentacles grip everything from politics to genes. All that denim walking New York and LA streets, cut and sewn in places like Ciudad Juarez and Bangladesh. Do you, beloved, know whose fingerprints trace the clothes you wear? Inside maquilas, grim labor camps, hands flutter at racing speed, women darning garments, stitching bras, shirts, jeans, propelling fashion industries' fickle needs. Fingers swollen with aching, mother's fingers, daughter's fingers, bent, warped fingers, appendages to sugarless hands.
you know, this project, it's called Disappearing Daughters, but really it's a story about mothers, the mothers that they left behind. And Erika, Corinne, tell us about some of the mothers that you met doing this project, and what you wanted people to know about their stories. And tell us, did you always plan to frame the story around the mothers?
So, you know, as Corinne said, we really wanted to honor the mothers and their bravery for speaking out. And we also wanted to honor their beloved daughters and create space for them and to help preserve their memory. So I think we just saw a little bit about Ernestina and her daughter. Next, we were wanted to focus on Norma Laguna Cabral. And, you know, she says that her 19-year-old daughter, Italy, never came home one afternoon in 2010. And 2 years later, authorities found fragments of her skull roughly an hour east of Juarez. And keeping Italy's memory alive is really important to Norma Laguna. She enjoyed soccer. She played on a local team. Italy was very confident, and she would always see the good in people. We recently caught up with Norma Laguna, and she says that 2020 has brought even more hardship to their family. Just before the pandemic closures this spring, Norma Laguna said that she pulled her 13-year-old daughter out of school after what she believes was an attempted kidnapping. And she told us, "I'd rather have a daughter without education than have no daughter at all." And she asked us tonight to share with you to keep putting pressure on local authorities. She says that nothing has changed in the 10 years since Italy's disappearance. Perla Yania Reyes Loya is seen at her home in Juarez with her children. Her 13-year-old daughter, Jocelyn, is seen here on her shirt. And Jocelyn disappeared in 2012 on a way to a friend's house and is still missing. Perla said that Jocelyn loved to go out with friends. She loved to play with her brothers. She was always laughing. And Jocelyn was a girl who had big dreams. Perla, she often engages in protest and activism. And she wants to remind the community that this is still happening. You know, she said, "We won't stop until we find them. We have to make young girls aware of this to prevent it."
Mm-hmm. One quick thing I want to add, Erika, is that when we, even before we got there, but when we got there for sure, we were so struck by how these mothers used memory and mourning as an act of protest. And didn't just do this privately, but really weaponized it to hold people accountable. And we really felt that it was important to bear witness and document this and take part in their creation of this collective memory of their daughters. So in these two slides, you've seen mothers wearing t-shirts with their daughters' images on them. They have painted murals. They have put together mosaics. They've taught each other art. And they're really the ones taking things into their own hands, not the government or the institutions. They're the one mapping these murders. They're the one tracking these femicides. And they do this despite so many risks to their personal safety. This year, 10 years ago, Marisela Escobedo was assassinated while protesting this impunity in front of the governor's palace. And that's a documentary on Netflix that recently came out. And it's just so incredible to me that after losing their daughters in such unimaginable ways, they've activated into protest in so many different ways. And so we really wanted to highlight this strength. And so it's really our pleasure today to have with us Norma.
Yeah, speaking of strength, to reintroduce her, Norma Ledezma Ortega is a lawyer. She's the founder of Justicia para Nuestras Hijas, or Justice for Our Daughters. She earned her law degree 4 years ago, more than a decade after her 16-year-old daughter, Paloma Angelica Escobar Ledezma, was killed. Norma, to start, thank you for being here. And could you tell us a little bit more about your daughter, Paloma?
Bueno, de inicio, cómo agradecerles esta enorme oportunidad que a través del trabajo que han hecho ver a las compañeras ahorita que estamos con la pandemia sin podernos juntar, volverlas a escuchar historias que he vivido junto con ellas a través de este trabajo que ustedes hicieron, pues me vuelve a emocionar, me vuelve a doler. Y con eso quiero iniciar dando un homenaje a esas madres, a esas compañeras, a cada una de las que he visto. Hablabas de doña Ernestina, a quien aprecio muchísimo, y la otra Norma, como le llaman. Yo soy Norma Ledezma, la otra es Norma Laguna. Y pues agradecer esa parte, ¿no? Y reconocer a estas compañeras, estas madres guerreras que han inmortalizado o hemos inmortalizado a nuestras hijas, ya que el Estado ha sido incapaz de hacerlo. Con ese reconocimiento, Claudia, a cada una de las personas del equipo que han hecho posible este momento, me permito contarles mi historia de más de 18 años. Yo soy Norma Ledezma Ortega, tengo 53 años y soy madre de Paloma Angélica Escobar Ledezma, una joven desaparecida en la capital, aquí a 350 kilómetros de Ciudad Juárez, estudiante, trabajadora de maquila junto conmigo. Fui madre de 2 hijos, de Paloma, que en aquel momento tenía 16 años, y Fabián, que tenía 12. Casada, ama de casa, empleada de una maquiladora, porque esa es la fuente de empleo que tenemos acá en el norte. Y escuchábamos las muertes de Juárez, las mujeres desaparecidas y muertas de Juárez, y creíamos que era un fenómeno exclusivo de una frontera. Toda vez que Ciudad Juárez colinda con El Paso, Texas, y muchas personas viajan del centro del país, del sur del país y de Centro y Sudamérica para buscar una fuente de vida cruzando a Estados Unidos. Y se quedan la mayoría, una gran mayoría en Ciudad Juárez. Entonces, por eso era la historia de las mujeres muertas de Ciudad Juárez. En su gran mayoría eran migrantes. Familias que no tenían arraigo. Eso es lo que se decía, o eso es lo que el gobierno quería que se dijera. Este fenómeno empezó de las mujeres muertas de 1993, con un gobierno insensible. No ha cambiado gran cosa, pero aquel decía, Francisco Barrio Terrazas en aquel momento decía que era porque se vestían de manera provocativa o porque salían a las maquiladoras a trabajar de noche o de madrugada. El fenómeno se extiende al 2002 cuando desaparece mi hija. Salió de la maquila un viernes y el sábado iba a estudiar al centro de la ciudad un diplomado de computación. Ya no regresó. Entonces la pesadilla que se vivía en Ciudad Juárez, yo la viví. Con apenas mi primaria, es decir, apenas saber leer y escribir, yo tenía un puesto en la maquiladora, yo era group leader, jefe de grupo. Mi hija era operadora ahí dentro de la empresa. Tengo que mencionar que la empresa fue muy solidaria y muy responsable, porque no creíamos que el fenómeno de Juárez se trasladaría a Chihuahua. La empresa me ofreció que si pedían recompensa, que si hablaban por alguna recompensa por Paloma, la empresa la pagaría. Me sostuvo el sueldo sin que yo acudiera a trabajar durante los 27 días ininterrumpidos que yo busqué a Paloma. Fue un 2 de marzo, un sábado 2 de marzo. La ciudad se llenó de volantes de Paloma. Las fotos, las radiodifusoras, las televisiones llenaban sus noticieros con una mujer, una joven desaparecida en el centro de Ciudad, Chihuahua. El fenómeno de Ciudad Juárez se replica en Ciudad Chihuahua. Eso se decía en las noticias. Yo no sabía qué estaba pasando. Lo único que yo sabía era que Paloma no se había ido como me lo juraban las autoridades. Me dijeron que se había ido con el novio, que por ser cristianos yo la reprimía mucho y no la dejaba andar en bares de noche. Entonces que ella tenía ganas de salir y se había jugado. Que tal vez me llegaría con un bebé en brazos porque yo la reprimía. Yo estaba segura que no era así. En ese proceso, 6 familias más, 6 madres más me buscaron de la misma capital y me dijeron que sus hijas también habían desaparecido, pero que la Procuraduría las limitaba para que no publicaran el caso de sus hijas. Era muy cerca del lugar donde Paloma había desaparecido. 6 familias más. Y luego nos unimos con las de Ciudad Juárez en esos mismos días. Y ahí los periodistas que decían, las mujeres que se juntaron para pedir justicia para nuestras hijas están en el Palacio de Gobierno, están en el Congreso. Es así como nace esta organización. Yo ni me imaginaba que era una AC, apenas sabía leer y escribir. Fue un 29 de marzo de ese mismo año, cuando a las puertas de mi casa tocan los policías con caras muy serias y nos dicen que tenemos que acudir, que habían encontrado, acudir a las oficinas, que habían encontrado el cuerpo de una mujer. Me dijeron eso nada más. Yo acudí, la subjefa de previas en aquel momento me dijo, señora, nunca le voy a mentir, se encontró el cuerpo de una mujer con pantalón de mezclilla, chamarra azul, pelo largo, botas de tacón, de plataforma. Probablemente sea su hija. Aquí en Chihuahua no había comisiones de víctimas, no había psicólogos, no había pruebas de ADN, no había absolutamente nada. Yo dije, no es, hay una resistencia. Yo juraba que Paloma no sería, que era alguien más, pero Paloma no. Nunca me dejaron ver el cuerpo. No había psicólogos, no había nadie que te ayudara, no había organizaciones, había aisladas, pero no había nada centrado. Y ese 29 de marzo, un Viernes Santo, en las oficinas de la Procuraduría, me mostraron su ropa. Había un detalle que yo no había dado. En el pie izquierdo mi hija traía una pulsera tejida. Acá se usa mucho poner los nombres. El nombre de ellas decía Paloma y Gerardo era el novio. Y lo traía la pulsera anudada en el tobillo izquierdo. Ahí estaba la pulsera. No había duda, era Paloma. Sin más anestesia y sin más ni nada, me dijeron, es el cuerpo, se lo vamos a entregar. ¿Está bien? Recibí el cuerpo ese Viernes Santo, ese viernes en la noche. Hay una especie de bloqueo de anestesia cuando una noticia así llega. Yo con los años he tratado de quitar eso y de poder comprender. A otro día sábado, bueno, habíamos que arreglar todo el funeral y todo lo que, con mucha confusión, y el sábado se acercan y me dicen, no le entregamos a su hija, pero le entregaremos al culpable. Ya tenían a un muchacho detenido culpándolo de la muerte de Paloma. No me voy a detener en eso porque es muy largo el proceso. Pero al descubrirles yo, por las claves que yo conocía de la policía, que el muchacho no era el que la había matado, se hace un pleito permanente entre la familia de Paloma y la autoridad. Yo sabía que nunca me iban a entregar al asesino, pero también sabía que ese muchacho no era. Yo pedí el domingo que yo la sepulté el sábado, el domingo pedí acudir al lugar donde la habían encontrado y era imposible que un solo muchacho hubiera entrado hasta ahí sin vehículo. No había sido posible. No tenía más conocimiento, era sentido común. Y así fue. El muchacho no era. Ante mi protesta pública tuvieron que soltarlo. Hoy, después de 18 años, todavía no sé quién la mató. Pero me voy a regresar. ¿Qué fue lo que aprendí? Aprendí que el conocimiento es poder. Yo conocía las claves de los policías y por eso les descubrí lo que habían fabricado. Me volví enemiga del Estado, yo sola, porque no había organizaciones. Allí nos formamos. Ese 29 de marzo, esa madrugada, ante esa caja de madera blanca cerrada, donde yacía los restos de mi hija, con esa aroma a flores y a velas, yo abracé su cajón, que fue lo que pude tener, y le juré esto. Cuando te tuve en mis brazos como mi primer hija, te juré que daría mi vida por la tuya, pero nadie me la preguntó, nadie me la pidió a cambio. Por lo tanto, hoy, este 29 de marzo, te juro que empeño mi vida para buscar justicia. Tengo 18 años y todavía no puedo encontrar la justicia. Pero mi promesa se extendió, porque entendí que el conocimiento era poder. Y entonces todo el dolor y toda la tristeza que tenía, tomé una decisión. Me tenía que enfrentar a ese monstruo que se llama Estado, a ese monstruo de impunidad amparado en esas oficinas enormes, monstruosas del gobierno mexicano. Pero no podía hacerlo nomás así. Hubo otras mujeres que me ayudaron, las 6 familias que se unieron con nosotros, otras mujeres maravillosas que se unieron, que ya tenían camino recorrido y nos ayudaron. Y allí empezó esta lucha. Ese 29 de marzo, yo volví a nacer, porque en esa tumba el dolor, yo ya había perdido lo que más amaba. Y creo que no me derrumbé porque tenía la otra mitad de mi corazón, mi hijo, que aquí está en un lado. Tiene 31 años y es abogado. Y me ayuda con la prevención para niños y niñas. Entonces, decidí que tenía que luchar. O me acurrucaba a llorar, tanto dolor. Cuando la sepulté, mi hijo se recuerda que no me podía levantar de la tumba. Yo me quería morir ahí con ella. Pero tenía que seguir. Y tomé esa decisión. Estudié mi secundaria en la maquiladora. Estudié la preparatoria abierta en la maquiladora. En el 2008 renuncié a la maquiladora para hacerme cargo de la organización que ya habíamos formado y que se constituyó formalmente en el 2005. Tenía que hacerlo. En el 2015 terminé mi carrera de licenciatura en Derecho. 2 años después, una maestría en Constitucional y Amparo. Pero no me define eso, no me define la carrera. Me define que soy la mamá de Paloma. Me define que sé lo que cada una de esas mujeres siente. Que mi compromiso hasta este día y esta organización que hoy presido, coordino, que se llama Justicia para Nuestras Hijas, tiene esta característica. Lo mejor que podemos hacer es acompañar a las familias. La raya está muy bien marcada. El Estado está del otro lado y nosotros de este otro. No vamos a parar nunca, y como lo decía doña Ernestina, ustedes la escucharon y lo han leído, no vamos a parar, porque cuando te roban a una hija como nos la robaron, te roban el miedo a morir. Nosotros ya no tenemos, solo esperamos ese día. Yo ahorita tengo el COVID. Hoy me hicieron un examen y está el 25% de mis pulmones dañados. Sin embargo, con todo esto, con todo y esto, hay una promesa. Y mi más grande temor es cerrar mis ojos para siempre y no haber cumplido mi promesa que le hice a Paloma. Mi promesa se extendió. Y hoy mi compromiso es la lucha para que todas las palomas vuelvan a su nido. Ese es mi compromiso. Gracias.
Thank you, Norma, for sharing that so much. I wish we could all be together right now instead of apart, but thank you so much and for sharing Paloma's story.
Dicen que vivimos en este o aquel lado de una frontera. Digo que eso es forraje para una imaginación sexista. El diente del coyote no muerde a solas y una sola pluma no hace al halcón volar. Los hilos no son cuestión de seres vivientes. Como trenza colgante en espalda de abuela, como cuentas de rosario. Enlazadas somos río y lluvia, polvo de estrellas.
Corinne and Erika, the project, Norma has talked about working in sort of some of these industries, and Erika, you talked about that before. And you also, through this project, sort of explored the making of art as a way to cope with this violence. Can you tell us more about Me and More and the other ways women are seeking justice and what if?
Norma, thank you again so much for your time today and sharing so much with us and being a part of this project. We are really grateful to all of the women and the mothers and activists who spend time with us, and just really wanted to say thank you. So we really had the honor of visiting Me and More, which is an incredible women's sewing studio that's working to create a sustainable business model that offers fair wages and a safe work environment and training to women. And visiting the studio, it's such a wonderful experience to meet everyone, to see all of these incredible designs of long dresses and tunics and protest patches. We watched how Candelaria, she wrapped dresses in flower petals and dyed them with natural materials. And co-founder and artist Jeanette Terrazas said, factories in Juarez created vulnerable working conditions for many women, and that their studio really acts in opposition to those mass production standards. They recently expanded into a second location. They're looking for funds to continue their development. But I think what struck us was that in Juarez, there are many organizations that have been around for a very long time. There are feminist collectives and artists and activists and writers who, do incredible work, from, sharing safety information and notices about missing women, to using art and murals and mosaics and demonstrations for acts of visual resistance. And, throughout the city, there are so many monuments to collective memory and to increase awareness of femicide and to put pressure on local authorities.
I think now, Claudia, if you wouldn't mind reading your poem, Maria, it's a way to end this portion of the event, and then we'll get to some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Norma, muchísimas gracias por tu testimonio, Norma, por tus palabras, por tu fortaleza, por tu inspiración. Te agradezco muchísimo que estés con nosotros esta noche. So I'm going to read the poem that concludes the book, Killing Marias. And I wanted to say before I read it, it's the last poem in the book. I wanted to say that as I was writing this on my own in my desk, with no contact with anyone, just really tuning into the presence and the lives of these women, at some points I felt that I was being guided as to what to write. I really felt a deep connection, a spiritual connection to these women. And I told myself then that if the book ever saw the light of day, that I would find a way to donate proceeds from the book to an organization working in Juarez. And the book came to be, and I was always following news about Juarez and came across a story in El País, the newspaper, the Spanish newspaper, had a profile of Norma Ledezma and Justicia para Nuestras Hijas. And at that moment, when I read that article, I knew that I had to reach out to Norma and ask her if there was a way that we could collaborate, in the sense that could whatever benefit the book, monetary benefit the book acquired, could in a way help her and her work and the other mothers. And that is that I reached out to her, I found her, and that is how I came about to have to connect with her, through this article in this international newspaper. So in fact, it was from the beginning, the part of the proceeds of the book benefit the work that Norma does and all of the mothers that that she works with. So this last poem that closes the book is titled Maria. Maria, may the flower of your birth open up each day, receive into its depth sun's honey rays, and at night, gently, may it fold its petals in sacred mystery. May it release its perfume in sorrow as in joy. May its essence bloom for long. Let us all remember on this and every day, however compelling, words are not flesh. Figurative language, life does not replace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Your poems are so amazing. Okay, folks, we're going to move on to some questions, a few more questions. Just want to remind everyone that if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and just to the left of the chat function, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I'm going to start with a couple of questions that I had and then get to yours as soon as possible. So I wanted to start, this is a story that takes place on the other side of the country from where you are in Seattle. And so I wanted to talk to you, Corinne and Erika, especially about why you felt this project, was relevant to Seattle and Washington readers, but really I could expand that to so many people in the US, because I think that there is this perception that these are issues that are not ours. These are issues that are somewhere else. And I think that's obviously not true, but talk to us about why you wanted to go this route.
Yeah, I think, I mentioned kind of peeling back the layers of the onion earlier. And one thing that really stuck with me is that so many of these structural conditions and inequities that made these women targets for their killers in Mexico, race, gender, economic disempowerment, they reach far across the border. They are universal. Our lawmakers, our policies, our corporations are all interconnected. There are businesses in Washington state that have factories in Juarez, in Tijuana, Nogales. Many of the women who are trafficked from Mexico end up being found in the United States. And even beyond just the United States, all over the world, women are killed for being women. Erika and I spent some time in Mexico last year reporting on other stories as well. And one of the stories we did focused on asylum seekers in Tijuana waiting under the Remain in Mexico policy. And we met victims of attempted murder who were applying for asylum in the US, trying to flee their attackers in El Salvador. Many of the migrants, the women, are fleeing gender-based violence. And here in the United States, the statistic we included in our story, 1 in 4 women has experienced sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking from a partner, 25% of women. And we all know that intimate partner violence, domestic violence has been increasing both in the United States and in Mexico since pandemic lockdowns. Here in Washington state, Erika and my colleagues, Lauren Frohn and Bettina Hansen, have been documenting the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement, the MMIW movement. And so this happens everywhere. It happens here. We just don't label it femicide.
Sorry about that. Norma, I had a question for you, which is, what did you want obviously, this is such an important issue. When you met Erika and Corinne and knew they were doing this project, what did you want them to take? What did you want readers to take away from this project, especially knowing so many of them, you know, would have been so far removed from this issue in Juarez?
Alguien dijo ahorita sobre la memoria. Verdad, justicia y reparación es lo que el gobierno o el derecho mexicano nos debe de garantizar, pero no lo ha hecho. La resiliencia de las madres por mantener la memoria de nuestras hijas va más allá de una persona sancionada y castigada o sentenciada en una cárcel. Es la inmortalidad de nuestras propias hijas. Entonces, el arte, la poesía, el teatro, son escenarios no explorados con dignidad. A veces son explorados para lucro y no para dignidad y memoria. Con Claudia, que fue con la primera que tuve la comunicación y luego el equipo, creo que la sensibilidad, el compromiso no se marca o no se determina en un contrato o en un documento. Se advierte en ese sentir, en ese compromiso. No siempre nos abrimos las madres para con cualquier persona. No siempre entregamos la intimidad de nuestro hogar, las fotografías, el lugar donde dormía la hija, el lugar donde comía, las playeras, sus collares, sus cosas. No siempre lo hacemos. En este proyecto, pues nos ganaron. Creo que ese compromiso, y de verdad, de corazón se los digo, porque yo soy muy quisquillosa para eso. No permito que lucren más allá, que sigan todavía exprimiendo la sangre inocente de nuestras hijas. Este proyecto nos prometía algo diferente. Nos prometía la memoria digna, que el mundo sepa que acá, no solo en el estado de Chihuahua, en particular el proyecto se desarrolló en Ciudad Juárez, porque allá nosotros trabajamos también, pero nosotros Justicia para Nuestras Hijas se atiende en todo el estado. Que acá en Chihuahua siguen asesinando a mujeres. Y sí, un gran número de mujeres es por violencia doméstica, pero otro no, como estos que vemos, entre ellos Paloma, Adriana y Dalí y todas las que vimos. No, es trata de personas con la protección del Estado. Es necesario que se sepa. Y solamente así, a través de la poesía tan digna, tan sensible, como está plasmada en este libro, en este proyecto, pues eso es lo que buscamos. Que el mundo sepa que hay no 5 o 10, son miles de hogares enlutados, pero que al leer ese poema volvemos a llorar y las volvemos a dignificar. No morirán mientras que estos poemas se sigan leyendo, se sigan difundiendo. Cada vez que hablan en estos poemas, hablan de las nuestras. Sus voces siguen siendo escuchadas a través de la lectura y de la exclamación. Eso es lo que buscamos con este proyecto.
Thank you, Norma. I want to talk about poetry a little bit more. A couple of people have asked in the chat if Claudia's book is available in Spanish, and Claudia is working on that now. Is that right, Claudia?
Yes.
Okay. So that will be coming soon. And a few other people have asked about resources. I think we'll touch back on this again, but Corinne did just put in the chat, if you want to look now and grab it, a link to some of the resources. So please check that out. I want to get back to the poetry for a second and how Norma beautifully put it, that this was about sort of telling the story in a different way and honoring this woman in a different way. And, you know, I don't know how many of folks on the panel or on the event today are not journalists, but the way this project was done is not typical of a lot of journalism endeavors, this marrying of poetry and journalism. And so I wanted to ask you, Corinne and Erika, how Claudia's poems kind of influenced the way you worked and you approached this story.
Yeah, you're definitely right, Vianna. This is not a usual thing we do, especially I think in newspaper journalism and legacy newspapers. But we luckily had worked with Claudia once before for a project called Seattle's Poem when she first became Seattle's civic poet. And, that really kind of opened the door to being more experimental. And when we first talked to Claudia about her approach to this poetry and approached her about collaborating on this project, what she said really impacted how we approached the entire project. One thing I loved about her poetry that so many people have praised it is that it's neither objectifying nor voyeuristic or anything that so much of pop culture around femicide is. Claudia found a way, as we wrote in the project, to capture a glimmer of beauty in the darkness. And so with this in mind, I created, before we went, a really big spreadsheet with all 7 of the poems that Claudia had selected. And we wanted to think of ways we could illustrate every single line of all 7 poems, but also, the ideas of her poetry, including resilience, rebirth, love, loyalty, allegiance. And so in the process of creating this really, really big shot list, I almost memorized every line of those 7 poems. And because of that, I think that we really absorbed the spirit of the poetry, and I really hope that's reflected in the footage. The poetry also gave us a lot of freedom to think outside the box and do something a little more artistic than what we usually do. It gave us more time to experiment and also to contemplate and be introspective. And I think that the entire structure of the project, for those of you who might not be as familiar with journalism, is really kind of an experiment. The narrative structure is different. I really wanted it to be based on feelings and emotions. And so taking you from that grief and that loss and that pain into, what Norma described as rebirth and being really very motivated to fight against this. So I was really conscious of how all of her images in concert with the poems helped set the tone of the piece. We wanted the narrative to be one of empathy and to have audience members really feel what the mothers are feeling and the women activists are feeling. And this affected everything from how we chose the colors of the photo groupings to what background music we used in the video poetry. And one thing I'll add on really quickly is that I think it's so interesting how art and journalism and media are connected here, because in talking to Claudia about the poems, one thing that inspired her was kind of media depiction of women and how women's bodies were so objectified. And that was part of the inspiration for her work, and her poetry book inspired our work, and we created new media. And after we published this project, several artists actually got in touch with us and asked if they could create art based on our work, including performance artists and visual artists. So it's really this cycle of art and media. And I think that's a really interesting concept to explore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to hop to some of the audience questions a little bit. There's several sort of asking in the same vein, kind of what is being done in Mexico right now to address these issues, if anything, and then the US. So I'm going to try to tackle a couple of those. One of them being if the current president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is he or even past presidents of Mexico, have they directly acknowledged these deaths, and if the government has made femicide a top priority to solve, or are they part of the problem? I don't know, Norma, if that is something you would like to tackle, or anyone else, of how the current president or past presidents have addressed femicide.
Ninguno ha tenido una postura de convicción, pero el actual está mucho peor. El presidente el presidente de la República, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, creo que no tiene ni idea de lo que realmente es el feminicidio. Se ha mantenido, es más, muy recientemente han estado reprimiendo las marchas o protestas en contra de los feminicidios. Actualmente se asesinan en el país a 10 mujeres diarias en el país. Entonces, el gobierno tiene prioridades políticamente más importantes para él, que no es el feminicidio, el gobierno federal. Ninguno lo mantuvo, ninguno ha sido, de todos los años que yo tengo, han pasado como 5 presidentes ya y realmente no, ninguno se ha manifestado, pero sí estamos ante un momento mucho más crítico en el cual no solo no lo reconoce, sino que le ha quitado presupuestos a las comisiones de víctimas, no solamente para las víctimas de feminicidio, para todas las víctimas. Acaba de eliminar 109 fideicomisos. Yo soy consejera de la comisión, consejera honorífica de la Comisión de Víctimas a nivel federal. Tenemos un pleito constante, pero él es un dictador. O sea, este es el peor presidente que nos ha tocado en estos 18 años. Y los gobiernos de los estados, pues políticamente hablando, sí mantienen el tema y sí hemos logrado. Por ejemplo, aquí en Chihuahua fue la primer fiscalía del país que lleva el nombre de Paloma Angélica Escobar Ledezma, mi hija, el centro de justicia donde está la fiscalía, pero pues lo hemos logrado, no son concesiones, lo hemos logrado con mucho esfuerzo, aquí a nivel local, es lo que hemos logrado, pero a nivel federal todavía dista años luz a que pueda ser reconocido y atendido el feminicidio, la violencia contra las mujeres.
Mm-hmm.
I'll add too that, the current president was asked about this increase that Mexico was seeing and the Mexican government recorded since the pandemic began about an increase of calls to emergency hotlines regarding violence against women. And they measured a big increase in March. And when the president was asked in May, he actually went on the record to say that 90% of those calls were false, which is really stunning because that is his own government's data that was collected. And I think that says a lot about how the current administration is treating femicide.
I mean, there's been a few questions in the chat about, who is responsible for this? Is it the involvement of cartels, things like that? I mean, do you feel, is there any prevailing theory, and do you feel like the government's sort of silence on these issues is possibly related to that? Like, why would they remain so silent?
Sí, estaba esperando esta pregunta. Para que este problema o esta situación haya existido durante tanto tiempo, en mi opinión y en los análisis que ya, ahora sí, después de 18 años ya con cierta preparación o con ciertas formas de poder realizar estrategias de investigación, sí, esta es la conclusión. Tenemos incluso estudios de antropología social y forense que nos concluyen. El último no tiene mucho, que no lo emitió unos expertos, en donde se considera lo siguiente: para que este fenómeno permanezca, se requieren 3 elementos. Se requiere el consumidor, el proveedor y la protección. El consumidor es quien consume. El proveedor es quien provee la mercancía, que son las mujeres. Y la protección no es precisamente del grupo de las bandas delictivas, es oficial. Esa protección es oficial de tal forma que puede haber desde un policía municipal hasta una persona de alto rango. En el caso de mi hija, de Paloma, lo llevamos a la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, la cual determina que, por supuesto, fueron violados los derechos de Paloma y de su familia, y le emite 9 recomendaciones al Estado. Bajo este rubro, porque llegamos a una solución amistosa, bajo este rubro hemos tenido incidencia para poder ver los organigramas criminales. En México, Chihuahua, Juárez es frontera para que pasen la droga desde Colombia para Estados Unidos, que es en donde la consumen. Pero el estado de Chihuahua es un lugar en donde llegan y permanecen, hay casas de seguridad. Entonces, ahí les prevén a las mujeres. Trafican drogas, trafican armas y, por supuesto, mujeres. Entonces, está determinado a través de estudios de antropología social que por eso persiste. El caso de Paloma actualmente se encuentra en una situación que será imposible llevar a cabo el ejercicio de la acción penal. Es decir, hasta ahorita la Fiscalía se encuentra incapacitada para resolverlo, pero sí ha determinado que la desaparición de las mujeres de aquella época, tanto en Ciudad Juárez como en Chihuahua, había desde gobernadores, procuradores, congresistas involucrados en este tráfico de mujeres, en esta trata. Antes era trata de blancas, hoy ya está tipificado como trata de personas. Tenemos ley general de trata de personas federal y ley general y ley de trata de personas estatal. Sí está tipificado. Sin embargo, no pueden ser juez y parte. Es decir, los legisladores, cuando emiten las penas para quien comete estos delitos, pues por supuesto que son benévolos si existen servidores públicos. Es decir, a un servidor público que podemos determinarle o imputarle alguna responsabilidad, tiene un periodo de prescripción muy pequeño para que puedan imputarle esa responsabilidad administrativa o penal. Entonces, ellos mismos dejan que pase el tiempo para que prescriba y ya no se pueda sancionar. Es un juego que tienen entre todos. Poder ejecutivo, poder legislativo y poder judicial. Es un monstruo, es un monstruo. La trata de personas ha existido siempre, va a existir y no hay. No hemos encontrado esa forma. Tenemos un equipo en Ciudad Juárez, por los recientes también, donde encontramos precisamente a Adriana Sarmiento, a Idalí y a otras. Se llama Valle de Juárez o le llamamos el Arroyo del Navajo, que es donde encontramos más de 20 o restos de más de 20 mujeres. Y en actualmente le llamamos el grupo de Valle de Juárez. Tenemos 54 víctimas, más de la mitad víctimas mortales y las demás todavía desaparecidas, pero ni el gobernador ni el fiscal general le meten el recurso necesario, a pesar de que le hemos demostrado que necesitamos incluso la coordinación con la Fiscalía General de la República para poder llegar a sancionar, para poder que la investigación avance, para descubrir a los responsables o a los que están coludidos dentro del Estado. Es algo muy difícil. Yo tengo desde el 2010 que me empecé a involucrar en Ciudad Juárez, tengo guardaespaldas. Ahorita ya tengo 3 guardaespaldas permanentes. Tengo incluso aquí a mis espaldas está la cámara de seguridad. Tengo aquí en mi casa blindado, precisamente porque las amenazas cada vez que entramos, en el caso de Adriana fue uno de los casos, el día que sepultamos a Adriana tuvimos una amenaza. Saliendo del panteón, cuando la estábamos sepultando, me hablaron y me dijeron, salte directamente, ya viene, me esperaron a medio camino, estás amenazada. Entonces, los malandros, así les llamamos acá, ¿no? Los malandros, los del crimen organizado, todo lo hacen coludidos con ciertos funcionarios. No te puedo decir que todos. Me tocó hace más de un año entrevistar a un preso y él me dijo, yo no le firmo nada porque los gobiernos son los mismos, pero yo era piloto aviador de cierto gobernador de Chihuahua y le traficaba la droga a Nuevo México, a Arizona. Entonces, imagínense el poder que tienen. O sea, esto es un monstruo y aquí estamos las madres de pie. Por eso, los poemas, por eso, la memoria es lo que nos queda. Porque esperar justicia del gobierno terrenalmente es muy difícil.
Yeah. Vianna, can I'd love to
Yes, please.
To Norma, because hearing her and watching her is just an incredible feat of stamina and strength for her and the mothers to continue to do this against these enormous odds, which we know are such in Mexico and in Latin America as well. I think that people ask me too, because I'm looking in the chat after reading sometimes, what can we do? People who read the book say, what can we do? And I think femicide is a project of silencing. It is a project of erasure. It is something that is so horrific that I think makes us afraid. I mean, Norma talked about how she no longer is afraid, but just even peeking into the way in which the women are treated and tortured is just a terrifying thing. So it's very easy to look away. I think it invites us to turn away from it. And I think what we need to do is not do that. I think that was the spirit in which I wrote the book, which is, no, we have to remember, we have to insist, we have to call their names, we have to be with them. We cannot let go of these women, because the moment we do, we have given up. And I think for us, those of us who are not living in Juarez, right? I mean, these things happen here too. It is silly to think that this is not happening here. But the least we could do is to pay attention, and it's to be aware of what's going on, and to ask, and to not let go of the memory of these women there and here and in other parts around the world. I think that is the most, it seems kind of a simple thing, but it's so important, because Norma just said that is what they have left, is people insisting, writing, talking, singing. I mean, just doing what Corinne and Erika have done, right? Writing poems, which is what I could do, to just insist in saying, no, we know this is happening. You will not silence us. Because the moment we allow the silencing to continue is a moment of acquiescence to their power. And it's a moment to saying, yes, okay, this happens to women, right? And that whole notion then that women are inferior and to be discarded. Right. I think it endorses that machismo, that narrative that we know so well. And so the one thing we could do is be aware of what we consume, which is so important. That's something we could do here, those of us who are on this side of the border, all of us actually, but those of us who feel far remote, and to continue to not to forget. I think that is just, it seems small, but I think it's huge. It's because otherwise the victims are the ones who are blamed. The mothers are made aside. And it's just incredible that it's the mothers who are keeping the memory and the awareness of what's going on there. I mean, that is just a feat of love and resilience and resistance. And the fact that when I met Norma, one of the things that I was astounded was that their project was to bring to justice through the judicial system the people who did these crimes. It wasn't a vigilante thing. It wasn't, we're going to go. It was a way of really asking for reform. It's a way of, no, we're going to hold people accountable, and we are going to do it through a system that will allow for this not to happen. I mean, that is such an ambitious project. And it's one that is, I mean, it's just fueled with so much love. And that's what makes her work and the work of the mothers so important, and that the least we could do is not forget. I'll stop with that.
I was going to say one quick thing too, that there's been a number of longer term projects on femicide in Juarez this last year. One has been the Netflix documentary, The Three Deaths of Marisela Escobedo. There's Forgotten Women of Juarez, which is a long form podcast. And I think here with us tonight too, one of the IWMF fellows, Alicia Fernandez, she worked on the Red Note podcast, which is an investigative podcast. And it recently released. And Alicia, she grew up in Juarez. She came of age in Juarez. Her first internship at a newspaper was covering femicide cases. And so I just wanted to give, she really helped us during the project and gave us really good advice. And so if you're interested in more, information about it, these are some good resources.
Thank you, Erika. And I think that might be, as we kind of wrap up toward the end, someone in the comments or the question said, what about the killing of girls in the state of Morelos? There have been girls found dead and no one talks about them, not even the media. And so one, we do want to acknowledge that we realize this is all over the country and all over, not just Mexico, but other places. But I also want to bring up sort of the media. I mean, here we're talking about these wonderful projects that have highlighted this, but there's so many that don't. And I wonder, Erika, Corinne, or anyone else, how you feel American media can do a better job of covering femicide in the US. I mean, that's not a term that we even use here. And what do you think we can do to move forward?
I think that's a really good and big question that we won't be able to finish in our time today. But I think one thing that has really struck me, especially seeing the events of this summer, this great protest movement we've seen here in the United States against police violence against Black and Brown people, we don't see that type of movement really for the treatment of women. We did have the Women's March, 1-2 years, but if you look at what's happening, not just in Mexico, but across Latin America, there's a huge feminist movement, and it is so powerful and it is so inspiring. And we see huge protests. And, I encourage those of you who are interested in these issues to look into it further. There is a wonderful protest song out of Chile that has gone viral. It's called A Rapist in Your Path in English. And it's incredibly powerful. And I think that even though we have gone through the Me Too movement here, it's still so stigmatized, even for us to talk about, not just media, but for us to just talk about as a society. So, as Claudia said, I think the important thing is to keep talking about it, keep raising these issues, keep the awareness really high. And for those of us in the audience who are journalists, I think it's really important to remember that we have so much power to determine what the narrative is based on how we tell the story. And if you're looking at the protest movement, we really need to be mindful about how we cover protesters. There are so many media outlets out there who are still calling people rioters. And I think I want to just quickly touch on this, but this story, as well as the story of the protests in the United States, both beg the question, what does justice look like? Do our existing systems and institutions, legal system, criminal system, judicial system, do they work to provide justice? What does justice mean? I think even in our story, we quoted Norma as saying that as a lawyer, she has one definition of justice, but as a mother, it's completely different. What is justice? Journalists have historically taken that idea for granted. We quote the police oftentimes as an official source without checking with the other side. What does that say? There are so many families who have been waiting for justice for years and years, whether it's in Mexico, whether it's in the United States. How many families will never have justice because of the way our systems are set up to protect the people who are perpetrating these injustices?
And I want to say a thank you to Corinne and Erika in particular, because they and the rest of the Seattle Times incredible video team, photographers, reporters have had an incredibly difficult year covering obviously COVID, but protests here in light of the murder of George Floyd, and have worked incredibly hard to bring those stories. So they continue to do this work here, and it's so important. I think we are getting close to the end of our event, but I wanted to make sure that Corinne and Erika, you had a chance to mention any resources that you'd like to, again, share with the audience before we close.
Yeah, I posted a few links in the chat, but I'll just share this screen. So if you're on your computer, go ahead and take a screen grab or take a picture with your phone. But These are just some of the resources that we also listed at the end of our project, Disappearing Daughters. So if you find Disappearing Daughters by the Seattle Times on whatever your preferred search engine is, you can find these links and more at the end of the project.
I think we have come to the end of our evening, so I want to thank everyone so much for being here. Obviously, Erika and Corinne for their amazing work, Claudia, Castro, for your amazing, amazing poetry, and Norma, you are a warrior, and I'm so moved by what you said today, and I don't think any of us are going to forget tonight. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. This was a really wonderful conversation. I hope you all read Disappearing Daughters. I hope you all get Killing Marias because it's an amazing book of poetry. And thank you to everyone.